Imagine being fresh out of prison, starting a new life, only to stumble upon a millionaire's darkest secret in their mansion. It sounds like a movie, right? But this happened in real life. You might think this is just some exaggerated tale, but the twists in this story are unbelievable. Before we continue, leave a comment below telling me where you're watching this video from. I'd love to know. Tim Anderson stood at the gates of the imposing mansion, his weathered duffel bag slung over his shoulder, feeling every bit the outsider he was. The Connecticut countryside stretched out behind him, a world away from the cold, unforgiving walls of the prison he'd called home for the past 5 years. He took a deep breath, inhaling the crisp autumn air, still unable to believe his luck. Or was it fate? Just 2 weeks ago, he'd been staring at the cracked ceiling of his cell, wondering how he'd piece his life back together once he was released. Now, here he was, about to start a job that seemed too good to be true. A caretaker position at a billionaire's estate. It was the kind of opportunity that didn't come along often, especially not for someone with his background. As Tim pressed the intercom button, he couldn't help but think of Jake, his old friend from the neighborhood. They'd lost touch years ago, long before Tim's life had taken its disastrous turn. But somehow, Jake had found him, reached out with this lifeline just when Tim needed it most. "You've paid your dues, man," Jake had said over the phone, his voice a mixture of sympathy and hope. "Robert Holloway, he's not an easy man to work for, but he doesn't care about your past, just your future." The gates creaked open, and Tim stepped onto the long, winding driveway. Each step felt like a move away from his past and towards what? Redemption? A clean slate? He wasn't sure, but for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope. The mansion loomed before him, a behemoth of stone and glass that seemed to touch the sky. Its windows reflected the fading sunlight, giving the impression of a structure ablaze. Tim couldn't help but feel a sense of awe mixed with trepidation. What secrets did this place hold? And what kind of man was Robert Holloway to live alone in such grandeur? As he approached the front door, it swung open, revealing a stern-faced woman in her 50s, her silver hair pulled back in a tight bun. "Mr. Anderson, I presume," she said, her voice clipped and efficient. "I'm Mrs. Clarence, the head housekeeper. Mr. Holloway is expecting you. Follow me, please." Tim nodded, swallowing hard as he stepped into the cavernous foyer. The opulence was overwhelming. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, priceless artwork adorning the walls. Yet despite its grandeur, the place felt empty, hollow somehow, as if all this luxury was just a facade, hiding something darker beneath. Mrs. Clarence led him through a maze of corridors, each turn revealing new wonders and deepening the sense of isolation. The few staff members they passed moved like ghosts, averting their eyes and hurrying along without a word. Finally, they stopped before an imposing oak door. Mrs. Clarence knocked twice, then ushered Tim inside. "Mr. Holloway, Tim Anderson has arrived." The room was a study, lined floor to ceiling with books. Leather chairs, antique globes, and delicate instruments filled the space, giving it the air of a Victorian gentleman's retreat. And there, standing by the window, was Robert Holloway himself. Tim's first impression was of a man who had once been powerful, but was now diminished somehow. Holloway was tall and lean, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that seemed to hang just a bit too loosely on his frame. His face was all angles and shadows, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to look right through Tim. "Mr. Anderson," Holloway said, his voice low and gravelly, as if unused to speaking. "Welcome to Windmere Manor. I trust your journey was uneventful?" Tim nodded, suddenly aware of how out of place he must look in his worn jeans and second-hand jacket. "Yes, sir. Thank you for this opportunity. Holloway waved a hand, cutting him off. "Mrs. Clarence will show you to your quarters and brief you on your duties. I expect discretion and efficiency from all my staff. Your past is your own, Mr. Anderson. Here, you'll be judged solely on your work. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir," Tim replied, both relieved and unsettled by Holloway's directness. "Good. That will be all for now." As Mrs. Clarence led him back out, Tim couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just been dismissed by a man who was used to being alone. The entire interaction had lasted less than 2 minutes, but it left Tim with more questions than answers. Who was Robert Holloway, really? And what had happened to make him retreat so completely from the world? As Tim settled into his new quarters, a modest but comfortable room in the staff wing, he couldn't help but feel that he'd stepped into something much bigger than a simple caretaker job. The mansion held secrets, that much was clear. And as he unpacked his meager belongings, Tim made a silent promise to himself. He would unravel the mystery of Windmere Manor and its reclusive owner. Little did he know, this promise would set him on a path that would change not only his life, but Robert Holloway's as well. For in the days and weeks to come, Tim would discover that sometimes the greatest prisons are the ones we build for ourselves, and that true freedom can only be found when we have the courage to face our deepest fears and regrets. As the sun set over the Connecticut hills, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns of Windmere Manor, Tim stood at his window, watching the darkness creep in. He felt a mix of excitement and apprehension, knowing that tomorrow would be the true test. Could he prove himself worthy of this second chance? Or would his past continue to haunt him, even in this place of new beginnings? Only time would tell. But for now, in the quiet of his new room, Tim allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Days turned into weeks, and Tim found himself settling into a routine at Windmere Manor. The work was hard but satisfying, maintaining the grounds, assisting with household repairs, and ensuring the smooth operation of the vast estate. Yet despite the busy schedule, Tim couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the place. It wasn't just the oppressive silence that seemed to permeate every corner of the mansion, or the way the other staff members scurried about like skittish mice. No, there was something else, a heaviness in the air that Tim couldn't quite put his finger on. One particularly dreary afternoon, Tim was polishing the banister of the grand staircase when he overheard hushed voices coming from the nearby parlor. Curiosity got the better of him, and he found himself inching closer, straining to make out the words. "Anniversary coming up," a woman's voice, Mrs. Clarence, he realized, was saying. "You know how he gets around this time of year." "Poor man," another voice replied, "he behind that locked door in the West Wing." Whatever secrets it held, they were the key to understanding Robert Holloway, and perhaps to helping him find a way out of the prison of grief he'd built for himself. As Tim made his way back to his room, the mansion seemed to creak and groan around him, as if aware that its secrets were on the verge of being exposed. He knew that pursuing this further could cost him his job, maybe even his shot at a new life, but he also knew that he couldn't turn back now. For the first time since arriving at Windmere Manor, Tim felt a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. He had been given a second chance at life, and now, perhaps, he could offer the same to Robert Holloway. With that thought in mind, Tim fell into a fitful sleep, his dreams filled with locked doors and the echoes of long-lost laughter. Tomorrow, he decided, he would begin his search for the truth in earnest. And maybe, just maybe, in helping Robert Holloway face his past, Tim could find a way to come to terms with his own. The following days were a whirlwind of covert investigations and careful observations for Tim. He threw himself into his work with renewed vigor, determined to avoid suspicion while he pieced together the puzzle of Robert Holloway's past. Every free moment was spent exploring the lesser-used parts of the mansion, searching for clues that might lead him to the truth. It was during one of these clandestine explorations that Tim made a discovery that would change everything. He was examining the intricate molding in a dusty, long-abandoned sitting room when his hand brushed against something metal. Heart racing, he pried at the loose section of wood, and out tumbled a small rusted key. Tim stared at it, lying innocently in his palm. Could it be? The key to the forbidden room in the West Wing? He closed his fingers around it, feeling the weight of possibility it represented. This could be the answer to all the questions that had been plaguing him since he arrived at Windmere Manor. But using it meant crossing a line, violating the trust that Robert Halloway had placed in him. Tim wrestled with his conscience, torn between his burning curiosity and his desire to respect his employer's privacy. In the end, though, the mystery proved too compelling to resist. That night, long after the rest of the household had retired, Tim crept through the darkened halls towards the West Wing. The key felt heavy in his pocket, a constant reminder of the magnitude of what he was about to do. As he approached the locked door, his heart pounded so loudly he was sure it would wake the entire house. With trembling hands, he inserted the key into the lock. For a moment, he feared it wouldn't work, that all of this had been for nothing. But then, with a soft click, the lock turned, and the door swung open on creaking hinges. Tim stepped inside, fumbling for the light switch. As the room illuminated, he gasped, overwhelmed by what he saw. It was a child's bedroom, frozen in time. Toys lay scattered about as if their owner had just stepped out for a moment. A rocking horse stood sentinel in one corner, while shelves lined with books and stuffed animals dominated another wall. But it was the thick layer of dust covering everything that drove home the truth. No one had entered this room in years. As Tim moved further into the room, his eyes were drawn to a faded drawing pinned to the wall. It showed 3 stick figures, a tall man, a woman, and a small child, all holding hands and smiling. Beneath it, in a child's unsteady scrawl, were the words, "My family." The realization hit Tim like a physical blow. Robert Halloway had had a family, a wife, and a child, and somehow he had lost them both. Overwhelmed, Tim sank onto the small bed, sending up a cloud of dust. His mind raced, trying to reconcile this new information with everything he knew about Robert Halloway. The man's isolation, his bitterness, the suffocating sadness that seemed to permeate every corner of Windmere Manor. It all made a tragic kind of sense now. As Tim sat there, surrounded by tea, this one belonging to the elderly gardener, Mr. Finch. To lose everything like that, it's no wonder he... The conversation abruptly halted as Tim accidentally bumped a nearby vase, sending it teetering. He managed to catch it before it fell, but the damage was done. Mrs. Clarence appeared in the doorway, her eyes narrowing suspiciously. "Mr. Anderson," she said, her tone frosty. "I believe the West Wing requires your attention. Now, if you please." Tim nodded, face burning with embarrassment as he hurried away. But his mind was racing. What had they been talking about? What had Robert Halloway lost? And why did it seem to cast such a long shadow over the entire household? That night, sleep eluded Tim. He tossed and turned, his dreams filled with fragments of overheard conversations and glimpses of locked doors. In one particularly vivid sequence, he found himself standing before an ornate door in a part of the mansion he'd never seen before. As he reached for the handle, a child's laughter echoed from somewhere behind him. He turned, heart pounding, only to find himself face to face with Robert Halloway, the older man's eyes filled with an unfathomable sadness. Tim woke with a start, drenched in sweat. The dream clung to him like cobwebs, leaving him with a sense of unease that persisted throughout the day. As he went about his tasks, he found his gaze continually drawn to the locked door in the West Wing, the one area of the mansion he'd been expressly forbidden to enter. What lay behind that door? and why did it feature so prominently in his dreams? As the days wore on, Tim's curiosity only grew. He began to pay closer attention to the comings and goings of the household, noting the way certain dates seemed to cast a pall over the entire staff. He started to piece together fragments of the mansion's history, gleaned from overheard conversations and careful observations. Robert Halloway, he learned, had once been a different man entirely. There were whispers of a time when the mansion had been filled with light and laughter, when parties and charity galas had been regular occurrences. But something had changed. Some tragedy had struck, leaving behind only the shell of the man Tim now knew. It was during one of his late-night patrols, a task he'd taken on to help ease his restless mind, that Tim made a discovery that would change everything. He was passing by one of the many unused guest rooms when a floorboard creaked underfoot. Pausing, he knelt down to examine it and found, to his surprise, that it was loose. Heart pounding, Tim pried up the board, revealing a small cavity beneath. And there, nestled in the darkness, was a leather-bound journal. He hesitated for a moment, knowing that this was a gross invasion of privacy. But the mystery that surrounded Windmere Manor and its owner had become an obsession, one he couldn't ignore. With trembling hands, he opened the journal and began to read. The entries were sporadic, dating back nearly a decade. At first, they painted a picture of a man on top of the world, successful, happily married, with a young son he adored. But as Tim turned the pages, the tone began to shift. There were mentions of arguments, of growing tensions. And then abruptly, the entries stopped. When they resumed months later, it was as if a different person entirely was writing. The words were filled with grief, with a pain so raw it seemed to leap off the page. There were mentions of a terrible accident, of loss beyond imagining, and threaded through it all was a guilt so profound it took Tim's breath away. As he read the final entry, dated just days before the journal had been hidden away, Tim felt a chill run down his spine. I've locked it all away, the memories, the pain, everything that reminds me of them. But I can still hear their laughter echoing through these empty halls. I don't know how much longer I can bear it. Perhaps it would have been better if I had died that day, too. Tim closed the journal, his mind reeling. The pieces were starting to fall into place, forming a picture that was as heartbreaking as it was illuminating. Robert Halloway wasn't just a recluse. He was a man drowning in grief and guilt, haunted by a past he couldn't escape. As Tim carefully replaced the floorboard, he knew that he could no longer remain a passive observer. Somehow, some way, he had to find a way to help Robert Halloway confront the ghosts that haunted him. But how could he? An ex-convict with his own troubled past, possibly hope to reach a man who had walled himself off so completely from the world. The answer, Tim realized, might lay remnants of a life long lost. He felt a profound sense of empathy wash over him. He thought of his own losses, the years stolen by prison, the family ties severed by his mistakes. In that moment, the distance between himself and Robert Halloway seemed to shrink, their pain intertwining in the dusty silence of the forgotten room. But Tim's reflections were abruptly interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Panic gripped him as he realized he'd left the door ajar in his shock. He scrambled to his feet, desperately looking for a place to hide, but it was too late. The door swung open fully, revealing Robert Halloway himself, his face a mask of fury and pain. "What are you doing in here?" Robert's voice was low, dangerous, a stark contrast to his usual detached demeanor. "Get out! Get out now!" Tim stumbled forward, words of apology tumbling from his lips, but Robert was beyond listening. As Tim slipped past him into the hallway, he caught a glimpse of the older man's face, and what he saw there stopped him in his tracks. Beyond the anger, there was a raw, unbearable anguish that made Tim's heart ache. Mr. Halloway, Tim began, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. Didn't mean to what? Robert snarled, rounding on him. Didn't mean to pry into my personal life? To violate the one condition of your employment here? His voice broke on the last word, the facade of anger crumbling to reveal the pain beneath. Tim took a deep breath, knowing that his next words could cost him everything, but unable to stay silent in the face of such suffering. I didn't mean to cause you pain, he said softly. But Mr. Halloway, Robert, I think it's time you talked about what happened. Keeping it locked away, it's killing you. For a long moment, Robert stared at him, his expression unreadable. Then, to Tim's shock, the older man's shoulders slumped, and he leaned heavily against the doorframe. You have no idea, he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. Then tell me, Tim urged gently. Please, let me help. Robert looked up, meeting Tim's gaze. In that moment, something shifted between them, a connection forged in shared pain and the tentative hope of healing. Slowly, Robert nodded, gesturing for Tim to follow him. As they made their way to Robert's study, Tim felt a mixture of trepidation and relief. He knew that whatever Robert was about to share would change everything, but he also knew, with a certainty that surprised him, that this was why he had been brought to Windmere Manor. Not just to find redemption for himself, but to help another lost soul find his way back to the light. The study was dark when they entered, lit only by the pale moonlight streaming through the windows. Robert moved to his desk, his movements stiff and uncertain, as if he was fighting against every instinct to retreat back into his shell of isolation. It was 5 years ago, Robert began, his voice barely audible. My wife, Sarah, and our son Jack. They were driving home from Jack's piano recital. I was supposed to be there, but I was working late. Again. He paused, swallowing hard. There was an accident. A drunk driver. They didn't stand a chance. Tim felt his heart constrict at the raw pain in Robert's voice. He wanted to offer comfort, but he knew that Robert needed to get this out, to finally give voice to the grief he'd been carrying for so long. I got the call at the office, Robert continued, his gaze fixed on something Tim couldn't see. By the time I got to the hospital, they were already gone. Just like that, my entire world. Destroyed. And it was my fault. If I had been there, if I had just left work on time for once. It wasn't your fault, Tim said softly, unable to stay silent any longer. You couldn't have known. Robert looked up, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Rationally, I know that, but the guilt, it eats at you, makes you question everything. I threw myself into work, thinking I could outrun the pain, but all I did was push away everyone who cared about me, and now I'm alone. Truly alone. Tim took a step forward, driven by an impulse he didn't fully understand. You're not alone, he said firmly. Not anymore. Robert stared at him, a flicker of something. Hope, perhaps, crossing his face. Why do you care? He asked, his voice raw with emotion. You barely know me. Tim took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would change everything. Because I understand what it's like to lose everything, he said quietly. To feel like you don't deserve a second chance. But Mr. Halloway, Robert, everyone deserves a chance at redemption. Even us. For a long moment, the two men stood in silence, the weight of their shared pain and the tentative possibility of healing hanging between them. Then, slowly, Robert nodded, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. Perhaps, he said softly, it's time I started believing that. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, Tim and Robert sat together, talking quietly. They shared their stories, their regrets, their hopes for the future. And in doing so, they began to forge a bond that would change both their lives forever. For Tim, it was the beginning of a journey he never could have anticipated when he first arrived at Windermere Manor. A journey of healing, of redemption, and of the transformative power of human connection. As he looked at Robert, seeing the spark of life returning to the older man's eyes, Tim felt a surge of hope for the future. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Two broken men, finding strength in each other's company, ready to begin the long, difficult process of rebuilding their lives. And as the sun rose over Windermere Manor, casting its warm glow over the grounds, it seemed to Tim that the oppressive darkness that had hung over the estate for so long was finally beginning to lift. A new day was dawning, for the mansion, for Robert, and for Tim himself. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be setbacks, moments of doubt, and old wounds that would take time to heal. But for the first time in years, both men felt a sense of purpose, a reason to keep moving forward. As they parted ways to begin their day, Tim paused at the door of the study. "Thank you," he said softly, "for trusting me with your story." Robert looked up, a mix of vulnerability and determination in his eyes. "Thank you," he replied, "for helping me remember that it's not too late to start living again." With those words, a silent understanding passed between them. Whatever the future held, they would face it together. Two unlikely allies, bound by shared pain and the hope of redemption. As Tim made his way back to his quarters, he felt lighter than he had in years. The mansion, which had seemed so oppressive and full of secrets just hours before, now felt alive with possibility. He knew there would be challenges ahead, but for the first time since his release from prison, he felt truly hopeful about the future. This, he realized, was what second chances were all about. Not just wiping the slate clean, but finding the courage to build something new from the ashes of the past. And as he looked out over the grounds of Windermere Manor, Tim knew that he and Robert had taken the first crucial steps on that journey together. The weeks that followed Tim's discovery and his heart-to-heart with Robert marked a turning point for both men. The oppressive silence that had once filled Windermere Manor began to lift, replaced by a cautious sense of hope and purpose. For Tim, the change was profound. No longer just a caretaker, he found himself becoming a confidant and friend to Robert. Their shared experiences of loss and regret created a bond that transcended their differences in background and social status. Tim threw himself into his work with renewed vigor, seeing the mansion not just as a job, but as a shared project, a tangible representation of their journey towards healing. One crisp autumn morning, Tim found Robert in the garden, staring thoughtfully at a patch of overgrown roses. "You know," Robert said, not turning around, "Sarah always loved these roses. She'd spend hours out here tending to them. After the accident, I couldn't bear to look at them. But now—" Tim stepped up beside him, surveying the tangled mess of thorns and withered blooms. "Maybe it's time to bring them back to life," he suggested gently. Robert nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Yes, I think you're right. Where should we start?" That simple question sparked a flurry of activity that would reshape Windermere Manor over the coming months. Tim and Robert worked side by side, clearing away years of neglect and breathing new life into the estate. They repaired crumbling stonework, repainted faded walls, and coaxed the gardens back to their former glory. As they worked, they talked about their pasts, their regrets, and their hopes for the future. Tim shared stories of his time in prison, of the mistakes that had led him there and the hard-won lessons he'd learned. Robert, in turn, opened up about his life with Sarah and Jack, sharing bittersweet memories that had been locked away for too long. the transformation wasn't limited to the physical grounds of the estate. The staff, who had grown accustomed to tiptoeing around their reclusive employer, watched in amazement as Robert began to engage with them, to take an interest in their lives and work. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over Windmere Manor for years began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of purpose and community. One evening, as Tim and Robert sat on the terrace, watching the sun set over the newly restored gardens, Robert broached a subject that had been on his mind for weeks. "Tim," he began, his voice thoughtful, "do you remember when you first arrived here, and I told you that your past was your own?" Tim nodded, unsure where this was going. "Well," Robert continued, "I've been thinking. Our pasts, they've shaped us, brought us to where we are now, but they don't have to define our futures. I think it's time we both started looking forward." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "Before the accident, Sarah and we had plans. Big plans. We wanted to use our resources to make a difference, especially for young people who'd had a rough start in life. We were going to set up a foundation, build a center for youth rehabilitation." Robert's voice trailed off, his eyes distant with memory. Tim waited, sensing there was more to come. "I abandoned those plans after I lost them," Robert said softly. "It felt disloyal somehow to move forward without them. But now I'm starting to think that the most disloyal thing I could do is to let their dreams die with them." He turned to Tim, his eyes alight with a passion that Tim had never seen before. "What do you think about reviving the project? We could do it right here, on the grounds of Windmere Manor. Use this place that's been a symbol of isolation and turn it into something that could help people, give them the second chances they need." Tim felt a surge of excitement at the idea. "I think it's brilliant," he said, his mind already racing with possibilities. "And I think I might be able to help. My experiences, both in prison and since, they could be valuable in shaping a program like that." Robert nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "Exactly what I was thinking. We could work on this together, build something that could really make a difference." As the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, the two men sat together, sketching out plans and sharing ideas. The project would be challenging, they knew. There would be obstacles to overcome, skeptics to convince, and their own doubts and fears to confront. But as Tim looked at Robert, seeing the spark of purpose that had been missing for so long, he knew that they were on the right path. This project wasn't just about helping others. It was about redemption, about taking the broken pieces of their pasts and using them to build something beautiful and meaningful. The next few months were a whirlwind of activity. Robert threw himself into the legal and financial aspects of setting up the foundation, while Tim focused on developing programs and reaching out to organizations that worked with at-risk youth. They brought in experts, consulted with community leaders, and began the process of transforming a portion of Windmere Manor's grounds into a state-of-the-art rehabilitation center. There were setbacks, of course, moments of doubt when the task seemed too big, the wounds of the past too raw. There were nights when Tim found Robert standing in the doorway of Jack's room, lost in memory and grief. And there were days when Tim's own past threatened to overwhelm him, when he questioned his right to be part of something so positive and hopeful. But through it all, they supported each other. When Robert faltered, Tim was there to remind him of the impact they could have, of the lives they could change. And when Tim's confidence wavered, Robert was quick to point out how far he'd come, how much he had to offer. As winter gave way to spring, the project began to take shape. The old stables were converted into classrooms and workshops. A section of the gardens was transformed into a therapeutic green space. And in what had once been the mansion's ballroom, a community center began to take shape, designed to be a safe haven for young people in need of guidance and support. The day the first group of teens arrived at Windmere Manor was one Tim would never forget. He stood beside Robert on the front steps, watching as the van pulled up the driveway. The young faces that peered out the windows were a mix of wariness and hope, expressions Tim recognized all too well from his own youth. As the teens filed out of the van, Tim felt a momentary pang of doubt. What right did he have to try and guide these kids? He was an ex-con, a man who had made more than his share of mistakes. But then he felt Robert's hand on his shoulder, steady and reassuring. "Remember," Robert said quietly, "it's our experiences, even the painful ones, that make us uniquely qualified to help these young people. We've been where they are. We know the way out." Tim nodded, squaring his shoulders. Robert was right. Their pasts, with all their mistakes and regrets, were not liabilities here. They were assets. They had walked through the fire and come out the other side. Now, they had the chance to help others do the same. As Tim stepped forward to greet the first young person, a lanky boy with wary eyes and hunched shoulders, he felt a sense of purpose unlike anything he'd ever experienced. This, he realized, was what true redemption looked like. Not just moving past your own mistakes, but using them as a foundation to help others avoid the same pitfalls. That night, as Tim stood at the window of his room, looking out over the grounds of Windmere Manor, he marveled at how much had changed in such a short time. The mansion that had once been a symbol of isolation and regret was now alive with possibility. The sound of laughter, something that had been absent for far too long, echoed through the halls, and as he watched Robert walking in the garden, pausing to chat with one of the teens, Tim felt a swell of emotion. They had both come so far, these two broken men who had found in each other the strength to rebuild their lives. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be challenges to face, setbacks to overcome. But for the first time in years, Tim felt truly, deeply hopeful about the future. He and Robert had been given a second chance, and they were determined to make the most of it. Not just for themselves, but for all the lost and struggling souls who would find their way to Windmere Manor in the years to come. As the stars came out, twinkling in the velvet sky above the mansion, Tim made a silent promise to himself, to Robert, and to all the young people they would help in the future. They would face whatever came together with courage and compassion. And in doing so, they would prove that it's never too late for a new beginning, never too late to turn a life around. The mansion's secret, the pain and loss that had haunted its halls for so long, had finally been brought into the light, and in its place, a new story was being written, a story of hope, of redemption, and of the transformative power of second chances. As spring blossomed into summer, Windmere Manor hummed with a newfound energy. The rehabilitation center, which they had named New Horizons, was in full swing, its programs growing and evolving with each passing week. Tim and Robert found themselves at the center of a whirlwind of activity, their days filled with the challenges and triumphs of running such an ambitious project. But for the first time in years, Tim felt truly, deeply hopeful about the future. He and Robert had been given a second chance, and they were determined to make the most of it. Not just for themselves, but for all the lost and struggling souls who would find their way to Windmere Manor in the years to come. As the stars came out, twinkling in the velvet sky above the mansion, Tim made a silent promise to himself, to Robert, and to all the young people they would help in the future. They would face whatever came together with courage and compassion. And in doing so, they would prove that it's never too late for a new beginning, never too late to turn a life around. The mansion's secret, the pain and loss that had haunted its halls for so long, had finally been brought into the light. And in its place, a new story was being written. A story of hope, of redemption, and of the transformative power of second chances. As spring blossomed into summer, Windmere Manor hummed with a newfound energy. The rehabilitation center, which they had named New Horizons, was in full swing, its programs growing and evolving with each passing week. Tim and Robert found themselves at the center of a whirlwind of activity, their days filled with the challenges and triumphs of running such an ambitious project. For Tim, the work was both rewarding and deeply personal. Each young person who came through their doors reminded him of himself at that age, angry, lost, and desperately in need of guidance. He threw himself into mentoring, drawing on his own experiences to connect with the teens in a way that many of the other staff couldn't. There was Joey, a sullen 16-year-old with a history of petty theft, who reminded Tim so much of himself that it was almost painful. Tim spent hours working with Joey in the center's woodshop, teaching him the skills he'd learned in prison. Slowly, as Joey's hands became occupied with creating rather than destroying, Tim saw a change come over the boy. The anger in his eyes began to fade, replaced by a spark of pride in his accomplishments. Then there was Maria, a quiet girl with haunted eyes, who flinched at loud noises and rarely spoke above a whisper. Tim recognized the signs of trauma and worked patiently with her, showing her how to tend the garden as a form of therapy. Watching Maria's face light up the first time she harvested vegetables she had grown herself was a moment Tim would never forget. But for every success story, there were setbacks that tested Tim's resolve. Some kids ran away, unable to believe that they deserved a second chance. Others lashed out, their pain manifesting as anger and violence. During these moments, Tim was grateful for Robert's steady presence and unwavering support. Robert, for his part, had undergone a transformation that amazed everyone who knew him. The reclusive, bitter man who had hidden away from the world was gone, replaced by someone who threw himself into the work with passionate dedication. He used his business acumen and connections to secure funding and resources for the center, and his gentle patience often broke through to kids who resisted everyone else's efforts. One evening, as Tim and Robert sat on the terrace after a particularly challenging day, Robert turned to Tim with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to think that losing Sarah and Jack was the end of my story, that there was nothing left for me but to fade away in this big, empty house." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the grounds where a group of teens were playing basketball, their laughter carried on the warm summer breeze. "But now I realize it was just the end of a chapter. What we're doing here, Tim, it's giving meaning to their loss. It's the legacy they would have wanted." Tim nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. "I know what you mean," he said. "When I was in prison, I thought my life was over, that I'd never be anything more than an ex-con. But this place, these kids, they're giving me a chance to rewrite my story too." As the summer progressed, word of New Horizons began to spread. Local newspapers ran stories about the center, praising its innovative approach to youth rehabilitation. Social workers and judges began referring more young people to their programs. The mansion that had once been a symbol of isolation was now a beacon of hope for the community. But with the increased attention came new challenges. Some members of the community were skeptical, worried about having troubled youth in their neighborhood. Others questioned Robert's motives, suggesting that the center was just a publicity stunt to rehabilitate his own image. Tim and Robert faced these challenges head-on, organizing open houses and community meetings to address concerns and showcase the positive impact of their work. Slowly but surely they began to win over even their harshest critics. One of the most powerful moments came when Joey, the boy Tim had mentored in the woodshop, stood up at a town hall meeting. His voice shaking slightly, he told the gathered crowd about how New Horizons had changed his life. Before I came here," he said, "I thought I was nothing, that I'd never amount to anything. But Mr. Anderson and Mr. Halloway, they saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. They gave me a chance when nobody else would. And now," he paused, swallowing hard, "now I know I can be somebody. I can have a future." There wasn't a dry eye in the room when Joey finished speaking. As Tim looked around at the moved faces of the community members, he felt a surge of pride and hope. This was what it was all about, not just changing individual lives, but changing perceptions, breaking down barriers, and building a more compassionate community. As summer faded into autumn, Tim and Robert found themselves reflecting on how far they'd come. The mansion, once a mausoleum of memories, was now alive with purpose. The gardens that had been overgrown and neglected now flourished, tended by caring hands, and the two men who had once been lost in their own pain were now guiding lights for others seeking their way out of darkness. One crisp October morning, as they walked through the orchard where some of the teens were harvesting apples, Robert turned to Tim with a smile. "You know," he said, "I was thinking about that night you found me in Jack's room. If someone had told me then that this is where we'd be now, I never would have believed them." Tim nodded, understanding completely. "It's pretty incredible, isn't it? How life can surprise you." "Indeed it is," Robert agreed. He paused, watching as a young girl reached up to pluck an apple from a high branch, her face alight with accomplishment. "Tim," he said softly, "I want you to know. I'm grateful. For your friendship, for your partnership in all of this. You didn't just help save these kids. You helped save me, too." Tim felt a warmth spread through his chest at Robert's words. "It goes both ways," he replied. "You gave me a chance when most people wouldn't have. You saw past my record to who I could be. I don't think I can ever thank you enough for that." As they continued their walk, greeting the teens and staff they passed, Tim marveled at the journey that had brought them to this point. From a chance job opportunity to a deep friendship and a shared mission, his path had taken turns he never could have anticipated. The road to healing was not always smooth. There were still difficult days, moments when the weight of the past threatened to overwhelm them. Tim still struggled with doubts about his worthiness, and there were nights when Robert's grief felt as fresh as the day he lost his family. But now they faced these challenges together. They had built a community around them, staff, volunteers, and the young people they helped, who supported each other through the hard times and celebrated the victories, big and small. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Tim and Robert stood on the steps of the mansion, watching as the day's activities wound down. Teens chatted and laughed as they made their way to the dining hall for dinner, while staff members exchanged friendly waves as they headed home for the evening. "You know," Tim said, a note of wonder in his voice, "sometimes I still can't believe this is real, that we actually did this." Robert nodded, his eyes bright with emotion. "It is quite remarkable, isn't it? But you know what amazes me even more?" He turned to Tim, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "We're just getting started." As they headed inside to join the others for dinner, Tim felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. The mansion's secret, the pain and loss that had haunted its halls, had been transformed into something beautiful and life-affirming. And in helping others find their way to healing, Tim and Robert had found their own path to redemption. The road ahead would undoubtedly hold new challenges and obstacles. But as Tim looked at the family they had built, this diverse, vibrant community of second chances, he knew that whatever came their way, they would face it together. And in doing so, they would continue to prove that it's never too late for a new beginning. Never too late to rewrite your story and find meaning in even the darkest chapters of life. The mansion that had once been a symbol of isolation and regret now stood as a beacon of hope, its doors open to all who sought a second chance. And for Tim and Robert, each new day brought with it the promise of more lives to touch, more stories to change, and more healing to be found. For themselves, and for all who found their way to Windmere Manor. As New Horizons flourished and grew, Tim found himself settling into a rhythm he never thought possible. The days were long and often challenging, but they were filled with a sense of purpose that made every moment worthwhile. He had found his calling in mentoring the troubled youth who came through their doors, using his own experiences to connect with them in a way that many others couldn't. But even as he thrived in his new role, there was a part of Tim's past that he had yet to fully confront: his estranged family. The thought of reaching out to them filled him with a mixture of longing and dread. Would they even want to hear from him after all this time? Could the bridges he had burned ever truly be rebuilt? It was Robert who finally pushed him to take that step. They would face it together. And in doing so, they would continue to prove that it's never too late for a new beginning. Never too late to rewrite your story and find meaning in even the darkest chapters of life. The mansion that had once been a symbol of isolation and regret now stood as a beacon of hope, its doors open to all who sought a second chance. And for Tim and Robert, each new day brought with it the promise of more lives to touch, more stories to change, and more healing to be found. For themselves, and for all who found their way to Windmere Manor. As New Horizons flourished and grew, Tim found himself settling into a rhythm he never thought possible. The days were long and often challenging, but they were filled with a sense of purpose that made every moment worthwhile. He had found his calling in mentoring the troubled youth who came through their doors, using his own experiences to connect with them in a way that many others couldn't. But even as he thrived in his new role, there was a part of Tim's past that he had yet to fully confront: his estranged family. The thought of reaching out to them filled him with a mixture of longing and dread. Would they even want to hear from him after all this time? Could the bridges he had burned ever truly be rebuilt? It was Robert who finally pushed him to take that step. "You've helped so many people face their pasts," he said one evening, as they sat in his study, going over the center's financial reports. "Don't you think it's time you did the same?" Tim knew Robert was right, but the thought of it made his stomach churn. Still, he couldn't deny the hypocrisy of encouraging the teens to reconnect with their families, while he continued to avoid his own. With Robert's encouragement, he finally worked up the courage to make the call. His brother Mike answered on the third ring. The conversation was awkward and stilted at first, years of hurt and misunderstanding creating a chasm between them. But as Tim haltingly explained about New Horizons and the work he was doing, he heard a shift in Mike's voice. "You know," Mike said, a note of wonder in his tone, "when Mom told me you'd gotten out and found a job at some rich guy's estate, I figured it was just a matter of time before you messed up again. But this, Tim, this is really something." The conversation ended with a tentative plan for Mike to visit New Horizons. As Tim hung up the phone, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. The day of Mike's visit dawned bright and clear. Tim was a bundle of nerves as he waited at the front gates of Windmere Manor. When Mike's car pulled up, Tim's breath caught in his throat. His brother looked older, more careworn than he remembered. But when Mike stepped out of the car and their eyes met, Tim saw a flicker of the bond they had once shared. "Hey, little brother," Mike said, his voice gruff with emotion. "This place is something else." Tim nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Instead, he gestured for Mike to follow him, beginning the tour that he had given countless times before. But this time, every word felt charged with meaning. every achievement a plea for understanding. As they walked the grounds, Tim shared stories of the teens they had helped, the lives that had been changed. He showed Mike the wood shop where he mentored kids like Joey, the gardens where Maria had found her voice, the classrooms where futures were being rewritten every day. Mike listened in silence, his expression unreadable. It wasn't until they reached the memorial garden, a quiet space dedicated to Sarah and Jack, that he finally spoke. "You've really found your place here, haven't you?" he said softly. Tim nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. "I have," he admitted. "Mike, I know I can't undo the mistakes I made, the pain I caused our family. But this place, these kids, they've given me a chance to do something good, to make a difference." Mike was quiet for a long moment, his gaze sweeping over the peaceful garden. Then, to Tim's surprise, he reached out and pulled him into a tight hug. "I'm proud of you, Tim," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It took guts to turn your life around like this. And I'm sorry I wasn't there for you when you got out. I should have given you a chance." As they embraced, Tim felt years of tension and regret begin to melt away. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There was still much to work through, trust to rebuild. But it was a beginning, a chance to reclaim the brotherhood they had lost. The rest of Mike's visit passed in a blur of introductions and tours. Tim watched with a mixture of pride and nervousness as his brother met Robert, half expecting the old class divisions to reassert themselves. But Robert, with his newfound warmth and openness, put Mike at ease, sharing stories of how instrumental Tim had been in bringing New Horizons to life. As the day drew to a close, Mike pulled Tim aside. "Listen," he said, a hint of his old mischievous grin playing at his lips. "I can't promise anything, but would it be okay if I brought the kids by sometime? I think they'd really like to see what their Uncle Tim is up to these days." Tim felt his heart swell at the thought of seeing his nieces and nephews again. "Yeah," he managed, blinking back tears. "Yeah, I'd like that a lot." As he watched Mike's car disappear down the driveway, Tim felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had faced one of his deepest fears, confronting his past, risking rejection from his family, and had come out the other side stronger for it. Later that evening, as he recounted the day's events to Robert, Tim realized how far he had come. The man who had arrived at Windmere Manor months ago, full of doubt and self-loathing, was gone. In his place stood someone who had found purpose, who had learned to forgive himself and ask forgiveness from others. Robert listened with a gentle smile, nodding in understanding. "You know," he said when Tim had finished, "watching you reconnect with your brother today, it reminded me of something Sarah used to say. She always believed that true strength wasn't about never falling down, but about having the courage to get back up and try again." Tim nodded, feeling the truth of those words resonate deep within him. "I think," he said slowly, "that's what we're really doing here at New Horizons. We're not just giving these kids skills or keeping them out of trouble. We're teaching them how to get back up, no matter how many times life knocks them down." As they sat together in companionable silence, watching the sun set over the grounds of Windmere Manor, Tim felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him, for the second chance he had been given, for the friendship he had found in Robert, and for the opportunity to help others find their way out of the darkness. The mansion that had once been a symbol of isolation and regret now stood as a testament to the power of redemption and the strength of the human spirit. And as Tim looked out over the place that had become his home, he knew that whatever challenges the future might hold, he was ready to face them. Not alone, but surrounded by the family he had found and the one he was rebuilding. The secret that had haunted Windmere Manor for so long had been transformed into a beacon of hope. its light reaching out to touch countless lives. And in that light, Tim had found not just redemption, but a new beginning, a chance to rewrite his story and help others do the same. As the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Tim made a silent promise to himself, to Robert, and to all those who would find their way to new horizons in the years to come. They would continue to face their pasts with courage, to build a future founded on compassion and understanding, and to prove, day by day, that it's never too late for a second chance. The mansion's secret had been unveiled, but the story it had sparked was far from over. It was, Tim realized with a smile, only just beginning. The grand opening of New Horizons was a day that would be etched in Tim's memory forever. After months of hard work, setbacks, and triumphs, the rehabilitation center was finally ready to open its doors to the public. The sprawling grounds of Windmere Manor had been transformed, with the stately mansion at its heart now surrounded by modern facilities, gardens, and recreational areas. As Tim stood on the makeshift stage erected on the front lawn, looking out at the sea of faces before him, he felt a mixture of pride, nervousness, and profound gratitude. The crowd was a diverse mix: local officials, community members, families of the teens they had helped, and reporters from various news outlets. But it was the group seated in the front row that made Tim's heart swell with emotion. His brother Mike, sister-in-law, and their children, all wearing matching New Horizons t-shirts and beaming up at him with pride. Robert stepped up to the microphone first, his voice strong and clear as he welcomed everyone to New Horizons. He spoke of second chances, of the transformative power of compassion, and of the journey that had led to this moment. As he introduced Tim, his voice softened with affection. None of this would have been possible without the vision, dedication, and unwavering spirit of my friend and partner in this endeavor, Tim Anderson. As Tim took his place at the podium, he felt a momentary flash of panic. Public speaking had never been his strong suit, and the importance of this moment weighed heavily on him. But then he caught Robert's encouraging nod, saw the supportive smiles of his family, and felt a calm settle over him. "Thank you all for being here today," Tim began, his voice growing stronger with each word. "A few years ago, if someone had told me I'd be standing here, helping to open a place like New Horizons, I wouldn't have believed them. I was lost, convinced that my past mistakes defined me, and that I didn't deserve a second chance." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. But that's the thing about second chances. They often come when we least expect them, and from the most unlikely places. For me, it came in the form of a job offer and a friendship that changed everything. Tim went on to share his journey, from his first days at Windmere Manor, to the moment he and Robert decided to create New Horizons. He spoke of the teens they'd helped, the lives they'd seen transformed, and the community that had grown around them. "What we've built here isn't just a rehabilitation center," Tim continued, his voice thick with emotion. "It's a place of hope, of healing, and of new beginnings. A place where past mistakes don't define you, where everyone gets a chance to rewrite their story." As he concluded his speech, Tim looked directly at his family in the front row. "To everyone who's supported us on this journey, to the community that's embraced our vision, and to all the young people who've trusted us with their futures, thank you. You've shown me that it's never too late to change, to grow, and to make a difference." The applause that followed was thunderous. As Tim stepped back from the podium, he felt Robert's hand on his shoulder, squeezing gently in silent support and pride. The rest of the day passed in a blur of ribbon-cutting ceremonies, tours, and heartfelt conversations. Tim found himself moved to tears more than once, especially when some of the teens they'd helped spoke about the impact New Horizons had had on their lives. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over Windmere Manor, Tim found a quiet moment to slip away from the festivities. He made his way to the memorial garden, needing a moment of reflection amidst the day's excitement. He stood there, looking at the plaque dedicated to Sarah and Jack, when he heard footsteps behind him. Turning, he saw Robert approaching, a peaceful smile on his face. "Quite a day, wasn't it?" Robert said, coming to stand beside him. Tim nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and find out it was all a dream." Robert chuckled softly. "I know the feeling. But it's real, Tim. All of it. We did this." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, both lost in thought. Finally, Robert spoke again, his voice soft but filled with conviction. "You know, when I lost Sarah and Jack, I thought my life was over. I couldn't see a way forward, couldn't imagine ever finding purpose again." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the flourishing gardens and the mansion beyond. "But now, looking at all we've accomplished, all the lives we're touching, I can't help but think they'd be proud. That somehow, we've managed to create a legacy worthy of their memory." Tim felt tears prick at his eyes. "They would be proud, Robert. Of you, of all of this. And I'm honored to be a part of it." Robert turned to him, his eyes shining with emotion. "We're family now, Tim. You, me, all those kids out there. We're building something that's going to outlast us both. A place where second chances aren't just given, they're expected." As they made their way back to the celebration, Tim felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. The mansion that had once been a symbol of isolation and regret now stood as a beacon of hope, its doors open to all who sought a new beginning. The secret that had haunted Windmere Manor for so long had been transformed into something beautiful and life-affirming. And in helping others find their way to healing, Tim and Robert had found their own path to redemption. As they rejoined the party, greeting well-wishers and sharing in the joy of the day, Tim knew that this was just the beginning. There would be challenges ahead, new stories to unfold, more lives to touch. But whatever the future held, they would face it together. A family forged not by blood, but by shared purpose and the unshakable belief in the power of second chances. The mansion's secret had been unveiled, but the story it had sparked was far from over. It was, Tim realized with a smile, only just beginning, and he couldn't wait to see what the next chapter would bring.